Imagine living through a winter so cold the air hurts your face, where temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, all inside a home made of wooden poles and animal hides. Somehow, Native American communities didn't just survive these conditions. They lived in warmth and comfort. Their tipis were smartly designed to trap heat, block wind, and adapt to extreme cold, using deep knowledge of nature and materials. If you enjoy learning about clever survival and forgotten history, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps. All right, tonight we're taking a short, cozy look at how Native Americans built and lived in tipis in brutal winter cold.
When you imagine a home built to survive winters at minus 30 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes question their life choices, you might picture something heavy, fortified, and aggressively unwelcoming. Thick stone walls, tiny windows, a fireplace so big it qualifies as a roommate. Basically a medieval castle without the castle. But the people who actually thrived in that environment weren't living in stone cubes. They were living in tipis, elegant aerodynamic structures that look simple from a distance, but are secretly smarter than half the buildings we construct today. And let me be blunt, tipis don't get nearly enough credit. If Europeans had invented these things, they would have written operas about them. There would be paintings titled Ode to the Perfect Cone, entire architectural programs dedicated to the sacred geometry of portable warmth. But because this brilliance came from indigenous peoples, a shocking number of history books shrug and say, a kind of tent. A tent? That's like calling a NASA spacecraft a metal canoe with ambition. From the outside, a teepee looks clean and minimalist, the kind of design that would get posted on Pinterest under off-grid goals. But every inch of it exists because generations of people watched the land carefully and learned exactly how the wind, snow and temperature behaved. Not guessed. Learned. Meanwhile, Europeans on the plains were building little square cabins that trapped smoke inside like they were trying to hotbox themselves into the afterlife. What blows my mind is how perfectly the teepee works with the environment. It doesn't try to fight the wind, it slices through it. It doesn't try to hold snow, it shrugs it off like a buffalo having a bad morning. Modern houses could never. They see one snowflake and immediately panic about roof damage. The teepee's response, cute, try harder, and honestly I admire that. It's architectural confidence. Here's my personal opinion. The teepee might be one of the smartest human inventions ever created. Portable, insulated, ventilated, warm in winter, cool in summer, easy to repair, easy to move. Even IKEA furniture can't compete with that list. And IKEA furniture comes with an instruction manual that looks like a hostage note. The teepee wasn't just a shelter, it was a survival machine, perfectly adapted, perfectly efficient and perfectly suited to a world trying daily to freeze you into a decorative ice sculpture. And that, my friends, is why people inside a teepee stayed alive while winter outside screamed like it was auditioning for a horror movie. Before a teepee could become the warm, elegant winter powerhouse it was, it needed a skeleton, and not the spooky Halloween kind. It needed poles, long ones, straight ones, strong ones. Fortunately, the Great Plains had exactly the right tree for the job, the lodgepole pine. A tree so perfectly designed for tipi construction that I suspect nature was showing off. Let's talk about these poles for a moment. They were tall, slim, lightweight, and surprisingly durable. basically the supermodels of the tree world. If you've ever tried to drag a giant wooden beam across a field, you know that lightweight and durable don't usually go together. But lodgepole pines pull it off. Honestly, trees shouldn't be allowed to have that kind of good genetics. The process of choosing poles wasn't random. People didn't just walk into the woods, point dramatically and yell that one. They understood exactly which trees worked and which ones didn't. And here comes my personal opinion. This is where indigenous engineering truly humbles modern people. Most of us can't pick a ripe avocado without causing emotional distress. Yet these communities selected structural materials with mathematical confidence. Once cut and prepared, the poles were arranged into a tripod, the foundation of the tipi. This tripod wasn't wobbly. It wasn't experimental. It wasn't, let's see if this holds. No, it was stable enough to withstand winter winds that could knock the personality out of a buffalo. And let's be honest, if your house can stay upright in a plains storm, you deserve a medal. After establishing the tripod, the remaining poles were placed around it in a precise spiral pattern. This wasn't just for looks, though it does look fantastic. The spiral helped distribute weight evenly, allowed snow to glide off gracefully, and created a cage-like structure strong enough to resist fierce gusts. This is the kind of engineering modern stadiums brag about. Except the tipi did it first without steel, computers or architectural firms charging outrageous consultation fees. Here's the part people never talk about. Lodgepole pine poles were reused for years, decades even. They travelled with families from camp to camp, winter to summer, across hunting grounds and seasonal sites. Imagine a house with reusable walls that don't fall apart 5 minutes after you assemble them. Something IKEA users can only dream about. In short, the lodgepole pine wasn't just a tree, it was the backbone of the plains home, a perfect architectural gift from the environment. And honestly, modern buildings could learn a thing or two from those poles. The type's cone shape might look simple, almost too simple, but that's part of the design's evil genius. It's the kind of architectural brilliance that hides behind effortless elegance. You look at it and think, oh, nice triangle. But then winter arrives. The temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The wind comes screaming across the plains like it's late for an appointment, and suddenly that triangle is performing miracles. Let's start with the obvious. A cone is aerodynamic. A tipi doesn't fight the wind. It doesn't argue with the wind. It doesn't stubbornly insist on being a rectangle like European houses. No, it simply leans back and says, do your worst, while the wind slides up and over it like it's been emotionally dismissed. I've always believed that if European colonists had arrived with less architectural ego and more willingness to observe, they would have stared at the tipi and said, oh, so that's how you avoid freezing to death. But no, they built boxes, cold boxes, smoky boxes, boxes that leaked heat like they were trying to cool the entire continent. Meanwhile, the tipi, with nothing more than poles and hides, behaved like it had a degree in aerodynamics. One of the most impressive features of the cone shape is its ability to shed snow. Snow doesn't pile up politely on the roof, it slides right off. This prevents the tipi from collapsing under weight and creates a kind of built-in maintenance system. You don't have to climb onto your roof with a shovel, scream into the void, and wonder why you chose to live somewhere cold. The tipi takes care of itself. The shape also influences heat distribution. Warm air naturally rises, and inside a tipi it circulates in a spiralling motion upward through the centre, then down along the walls. The result, even heating. No freezing corners, No cold draft stabbing you in the kidneys while you sleep. I can't say the same for most modern apartments. Let's not forget stability. A tipi can handle storms that would rip a colonial house apart like a toddler opening a gift. The cone-shaped channels stress downward through the poles into the ground. This is why tipis bend, flex, and survive instead of breaking. A building doesn't need to defeat nature, it needs to cooperate with it, something humans often forget. Here's my personal opinion. If the cone shape had been invented in Europe, architects would still be bragging about it today. There would be statues, parades, a national holiday dedicated to the holy cone of structural integrity. But indigenous nations perfected it quietly, efficiently and beautifully because the goal wasn't praise. The goal was survival, and the cone delivered. Once the tipi's wooden skeleton stood proudly against the plains wind, looking like the world's most intimidating tripod. It was time to dress it, and not with just any material. No flimsy cloth, no sad colonial canvas, no we hope this works fabric. Tipis were wrapped in buffalo hides, one of nature's greatest winter inventions, and honestly better insulation than half of what modern outdoor stores sell for outrageous prices. Let me be clear, buffalo hides weren't chosen because they were convenient, they were chosen because they were perfect. A buffalo is basically a walking furnace wrapped in fur and muscle, surviving winters so cold even the snow considered relocating. If an animal can shrug at minus 30 degrees Celsius like it's early autumn, its hide is absolutely the thing you want surrounding your home. Sewing the hides together was an art form. It wasn't grab a needle and hope for the best. It took skill, patience, and generations of perfected technique. The hides were softened, shaped, and stitched using sinew, durable, flexible, and far superior to most threads found today. I personally believe modern sewing tools would cry if they saw what sinew could do. You could lasso a small car with that stuff. Once sewn, the covering became a single massive sheet, a winter cloak large enough to shame any medieval king. Draping it over the tipi wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was done in a specific sequence, aligning the seams so wind flowed over them instead of through them. These were the details Europeans didn't understand. They thought homes needed thick logs, bricks and prayers. Meanwhile, native nations were creating an aerodynamic, insulated, weatherproof masterpiece with hides and knowledge. One of my favourite aspects is how the hide covering wasn't just functional, it was adaptable. In winter, extra hides could be added for more insulation. In summer, sections could be rolled up to allow airflow. Meanwhile, most European settlers spent winter alternately freezing and smoking themselves out of their cabins, wondering what mysterious force prevented comfortable living. Spoiler, it was poor design, and here's a personal opinion no one asked for, but I'll say anyway. The buffalo hide covering might be the most elegant example of using the land without abusing the land. The hides were a gift, not a resource to exploit endlessly, but something to respect, use wisely and honour. The final result, a tipi wrapped so tightly and intelligently that even roaring winter winds had to take a moment and say, well, all right, fair enough. If you've ever seen a buffalo up close, you know two things immediately. One, it is enormous, and two, it is dressed for winter, like it's preparing to battle the Ice Age directly. Buffalo hides weren't just warm, they were absurdly warm, unfairly warm. Warm in a way that makes you question why modern winter jackets cost so much and perform so little. I've worn jackets marketed as windproof, thermal or Arctic grade. and somehow a buffalo in January still looks more comfortable than I do walking to the mailbox. And this is exactly why buffalo hides form the winter armour of the teepee. A buffalo spent its whole life outdoors, casually existing at temperatures that make humans panic. Minus 30 degrees Celsius. That's Tuesday for a buffalo. The fur is dense, the hide thick, and the insulation qualities are so good that snow falling on a buffalo doesn't even melt, meaning its body is holding heat that efficiently. That's not biology, that's a flex. So, imagine stitching multiple hides together into one giant weatherproof cover. It was like wrapping your entire home in the North American equivalent of a luxury polar survival suit. But unlike modern clothing companies, the buffalo didn't try to upsell you with phrases like ultra-light, breathable, or revolutionary fabric technology. The hide simply said, "I will keep you alive. You're welcome." Another thing I personally love, the hides weren't used wastefully. Nothing on a buffalo was thrown away. Meat, bones, sinew, fat, hooves, everything had a purpose. The hides were treated, softened, tanned, and prepared with knowledge accumulated over hundreds of generations. People today struggle to assemble a bookshelf from a Scandinavian furniture store. Meanwhile, these communities were turning massive animal hides into airtight winter-ready home insulation. The hide's thickness made them excellent at blocking wind. And if you've never stood on the Great Plains during a winter storm, allow me to describe it. The wind does not blow, it attacks. It behaves like it has unresolved emotional issues. It finds every gap, every crack, every weakness. Buffalo hide handle that wind like a veteran bouncer at a rowdy tavern. No entry. Move along. The best part, the buffalo hide tipi didn't just keep warmth in, it kept moisture out. Snow slid off instead of sticking. Rain beaded and rolled away. This wasn't primitive technology. This was highly refined environmental engineering. My personal opinion, if buffalo hide insulation was sold today, it would cost a fortune. It would be marketed as artisan, eco-friendly thermal shielding, and instantly sell out to wealthy people who claim to love nature but panic when they see an actual insect. The teepee didn't just use buffalo hides, it maximised their genius. If the buffalo hide exterior was the teepee's heavy winter coat, then the inner lining was the hidden layer of engineering genius that most people never notice. At first glance, it looks simple. Just another layer of hide or cloth hanging on the inside walls. But in reality, this lining transformed the tipi from very good shelter into how is this warmer than a colonial cabin built by a dozen men with axes and hope. The lining created a double-wall insulation system. This wasn't guesswork, it was intentional, refined through generations. One layer of hide on the outside kept out wind, snow, and whatever weather was currently trying to ruin someone's week. The inner lining, suspended several inches inside, created a pocket of air between the two layers. That air pocket functioned exactly like the insulation in modern homes, except without fiberglass foam or the existential dread of home repair bills. When the central fire burned, warm air rose naturally and slipped upward between the lining and the outer cover, circulating in a controlled cycle. Instead of escaping into the night or getting trapped at the top of the teepee, that warm air was guided downward along the interior, maintaining a consistent and comfortable temperature inside. The result was a convection system so efficient that even harsh winter temperatures outside could not penetrate the living space. The inner lining also played a key role in smoke management. Smoke from the central fire didn't drift sideways across the floor. making everyone cough like they were auditioning for a 19th century consumption drama. Instead, the lining funneled the smoke upward toward the smoke hole, where the adjustable flaps allowed it to escape. The system balanced airflow. Fresh air entered from the bottom edge of the teepee, warmed from the fire and inner air pocket, and rose upward, pushing smoke out while keeping heat in. From a practical standpoint, the lining also prevented drafts from racing along the ground, a problem that plagued European-style dwellings. Cold air simply couldn't sweep across the floor when the lining gently redirected it upward into the warm airflow. Floors covered with hides and mats benefited even more from this controlled movement, creating a surprisingly cosy environment. The brilliance of the lining came from its adaptability. In winter, it could be lowered fully to trap heat. In summer, it could be raised for ventilation. Everything about it was adjustable, responsive, and designed to work with natural forces rather than against them. No excess materials, no wasted space, no battles with the weather. Just smart, efficient engineering woven deeply into everyday life. At the top of every teepee sits one of its most overlooked yet brilliant features, the smoke flaps. To an untrained eye, they might appear decorative, two triangular pieces of hide flapping politely in the wind. But to anyone who has ever lived through a winter fire in an enclosed space, these flaps are nothing short of heroic. They are in essence the type's climate control system. Centuries before anyone invented thermostats, chimneys, or the modern obsession with smart home technology, the smoke flaps controlled the ventilation of the teepee. When the central fire burned, usually small, steady and well managed, it produced smoke that naturally rose toward the top of the structure. Without a way to guide that smoke out, the interior would quickly resemble a wood-fired sauna gone terribly wrong. But the flaps directed the smoke upward and outward, functioning like an adjustable chimney. By using two long poles, the flaps could be opened, closed, or angled in specific directions depending on the wind. If the wind shifted, which it often did on the plains, usually with the enthusiasm of someone slamming a door, the flaps could be repositioned to ensure smoke escaped efficiently. This allowed fresh air to enter from the bottom, while warm air circulated in a controlled pattern. What makes this design especially clever is how responsive it is. The flaps didn't require ropes, gears, pulley, or complicated mechanical systems. They required two poles and the understanding of how the wind behaved. With a quick adjustment, the entire airflow of the teepee could be changed. Meanwhile, European settlers were building square houses with chimneys that frequently clogged, smoked, or collapsed under snow because they were not designed with local conditions in mind. The smoke flaps also played a key role in temperature regulation. Open them wide and heat escapes, cooling the tipi during warmer seasons. Narrow them and the tipi retains warmth more effectively. In winter, when temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius and the world outside felt like a hostile refrigerator, careful flap adjustments ensured the interior stayed warm without suffocating the occupants. Their placement at the peak of the cone was intentional. The rising warm air created a natural draft that pulled smoke upward. The flaps acting as directional vents used this upward flow to clean the air inside while maintaining comfort. No trapped smoke, no wasted heat, no need to build a chimney taller than the house itself. In short, the smoke flaps transformed the top of the teepee from just an opening into a dynamic, elegant, low-tech masterpiece of environmental control. Simple, effective, reliable. a solution so intelligent that even today architects study it with interest and maybe a touch of envy. At the heart of every tipi, literally and metaphorically, burned a small, steady fire. Not a roaring bonfire, not a dramatic blaze worthy of a fantasy movie, but a carefully controlled hearth that provided warmth, light, and a place to cook without turning the entire structure into a smoke chamber or an emergency situation. The central hearth was the quiet workhorse of tipi life, doing everything a European fireplace did, but with far fewer structural complaints. The placement of the fire in the exact centre was no accident. It ensured even heat distribution, efficient smoke movement, and safe distance from the walls. If you've ever lit a fire too close to something flammable, like a curtain, a log cabin wall, or your own dignity, you'll understand the importance of this design choice. The tipi's geometry allowed the fire's heat to rise straight upward, gather beneath the smoke hole, and move through the warm air channels created by the inner lining. A small fire was more than enough. The tipi didn't need a massive blaze to maintain warmth at minus 30 degrees Celsius, because the structure itself did most of the thermal work. A modest flame could keep the interior surprisingly comfortable, something that baffled early European observers who assumed you needed to build a fire large enough to melt the Arctic. Instead, the tipi relied on efficiency rather than brute force, which is a lesson modern heating systems could stand to relearn. The hearth was multifunctional. It provided light at night, heat for cooking, and warmth for sleeping. Pots could hang above it. Food could be roasted beside it. And in emergencies, it doubled as a primitive drying machine. Essential in a climate where wet clothing was not merely an inconvenience, but a potential health hazard. Despite all this utility, the fire remained remarkably contained. The smoke hole and flaps prevented build-up, and the lining helped direct air upward, ensuring that the inhabitants weren't constantly coughing or squinting through a fog of burnt wood. But perhaps the most impressive part of the hearth system was how well it cooperated with the type's shape. As warm air rose, it created a natural current that drew fresh air from the bottom edge of the tipi. This created a self-sustaining ventilation cycle that required no chimneys, no metal pipes, and no winter trips onto icy rooftops to unclog anything. It was easy to maintain and quick to adjust. It was, simply put, a perfect example of achieving comfort and survival through thoughtful design rather than overwhelming force. The central hearth didn't dominate the tipi, it harmonised with it. Life inside a winter tipi wasn't just warm, it was organised, intentional, and surprisingly comfortable. If you've ever lived in a modern apartment designed by someone who apparently hates humans, you'll appreciate how well the interior of a tipi made use of space. Nothing was random, nothing was shoved into a corner just because everything had a purpose, and that purpose usually supported warmth, togetherness, or survival, preferably all three. The interior layout followed a practical logic developed over generations. Sleeping areas were placed around the edges, where hides and furs insulated the ground from the bitter cold outside. This ring of bedding created both warmth and a natural boundary, giving each person a personal space despite the open floor plan. And honestly, it was more space efficient than most studio apartments. Plus, no one was arguing with the landlord about heating. At the centre sat the hearth, the tipi's sun, the gravity well around which daily life orbited. People gathered there to cook, talk, make tools, repair clothing, tell stories, and occasionally contemplate why the wind outside sounded like it was trying to file a complaint. The circular arrangement encouraged eye contact and conversation, something designers of open concept homes keep trying and failing to recreate. What made the tipi so effective as a communal space was how equal the interior felt. There were no cold corners, no isolated nooks, and no darker, slightly suspicious areas like in a log cabin. The entire space was warmed by the convection created between the inner lining and outer cover. This meant no one was ever forced to sleep in the drafty zone, also known as the spot Europeans assigned to their least favourite family members. Hooks, poles and lines allowed belongings to be stored efficiently along the walls. Tools, clothing, bags, cooking items all had their place. Even drying racks for wet gear could be suspended from the poles above, taking advantage of rising warm air. A tipi could transform between a living room, bedroom, workshop, kitchen and gathering hall without ever feeling cramped. But the real magic was how the structure supported social connection. The warmth invited conversation, the circular shape encouraged participation, the open space allowed for rituals, storytelling, teaching, singing and laughter, all while the storm outside raged like an angry opera singer. A winter tipi was not just a shelter, it was a living, breathing community space, a place where families didn't just survive the cold, they shared life within it. One of the most underrated achievements of the winter tipi wasn't the aerodynamic design, the smoke control engineering, or even the buffalo hide insulation. No, it was the fact that people inside weren't forced to sit, sleep or walk on frozen ground like reluctant penguins. The floor of a winter tipi was its own system of insulation, comfort and practical design, turning icy soil into something surprisingly warm and livable in 30 degrees Celsius. That's nothing short of a small miracle. The foundation of the floor was a layer of brush, grass or mats laid down to create separation between the earth and the living space. This first layer acted like a buffer zone, the diplomatic negotiator keeping the freezing ground from declaring war on everyone's feet. Placing brush or mats directly on the soil also prevented moisture from creeping upward, which is important because there are few things more unpleasant in winter than discovering your bedding has become a sponge. On top of this first layer came animal hides, especially buffalo robes or deer hides. These hides provided not only warmth, but softness, a huge upgrade from the harder surfaces found in European cabins of the same era. Even today, stepping onto a warm fur surface on a cold morning feels luxurious. In a tipi, it wasn't luxury. It was survival with style. These hides also created insulating pockets similar to modern flooring techniques. Warm air circulated downward from the central fire and radiated across the floor layers, keeping the space beneath sleeping areas surprisingly pleasant. This wasn't just better than the cold ground, it was genuinely warm. The kind of warm where you can sit comfortably while the world outside tries its best impression of a frozen wasteland. Another clever feature was how flexible the floor setup was. If conditions changed, more people arrived, weather shifted, or storage needed to be reorganized. Hides could be rearranged easily. Sleeping areas could be expanded or tightened. Additional furs could be layered for extra insulation. The floor was not a static element. It adapted as efficiently as the tipi itself, and there was a practical hygiene advantage too. If snow or mud got tracked inside, and let's be honest, someone always tracks something inside, the hides could be lifted, shaken, cleaned or dried near the fire. Try doing that with a colonial wooden floor. Spoiler, it doesn't go well. Altogether, the floor system worked harmoniously with the tipi's thermal design. Heat rising from the hearth, insulation from the hides, airflow from the lining. Everything protected the family from the brutal cold outside. So, while the wind tried to turn the plains into a frozen battlefield, the people inside sat on warm ground, wrapped in comfort, proving once again that good design beats brute force every time. One of the most astonishing features of the teepee wasn't how warm it stayed, how cleverly it ventilated smoke, or how beautifully it handled minus 30 degrees Celsius. No, the real plot twist is that the entire structure was portable, and not technically portable the way modern furniture claims to be, which usually means you'll regret this in 10 minutes. The teepee was truly portable, easy to take down, quick to pack, simple to move, and fast to rebuild. In other words, it was everything a European cabin was not. A well-practiced family could dismantle a teepee in under an hour. The poles were unleashed, the hide covering folded, the interior lining packed, and the household items bundled efficiently. No nails to pry out, no beams to struggle with, no roofs collapsing halfway through the process. The design recognised something Europeans often forgot. Humans move, animals migrate, seasons change, food sources shift. A home should adapt to life, not chain people to a single location. Once disassembled, the teepee components were transported using a travois, a simple yet effective sled-like frame pulled by dogs in earlier periods and horses after their introduction. The poles themselves often doubled as the travo's rails, proving again that every part of the teepee had multiple uses. Nothing was wasted, nothing was decorative. Everything served a purpose. Meanwhile, European settlers were busy chopping down forests to build wooden houses they abandoned a year later because they placed them in terrible locations. But what truly sets the teepee apart is how quickly it could be rebuilt. The same family who took it down in under an hour could have it standing again by midday. Poles arranged, hide covering secured, lining hung, half hearth lit. Imagine relocating your entire home in the time it takes most people to assemble a single piece of flat pack furniture. And without the emotional damage, mobility was not a luxury. It was essential to the rhythm of life. Hunting patterns, seasons, water availability and resource cycles demanded movement. The teepee allowed families to follow the land without sacrificing comfort. No need to choose between warmth and mobility. No need to drag a wooden cabin across the plains like a particularly uncooperative pet. The type solved the problem elegantly. Your home moves with you, not against you. Portability also strengthened community bonds. Camps could come together, expand, merge, or divide as needed. Families could join seasonal gatherings, ceremonies, or hunts, knowing their homes could be packed and ready at a moment's notice. In a world shaped by the vastness of the plains, the teepee mobility wasn't just convenience, it was survival made simple. If you've ever lived in a house with a poorly sealed front door, you know how a single draft can undo an entire heating system. Now imagine dealing with that draft at minus 30 degrees Celsius when the wind is coming at you sideways like it's personally offended by your existence. The entrance of a winter teepee had to handle exactly that, and it did so with a kind of quiet, confident brilliance that modern architects could learn from. The first line of defence was orientation. Teepees traditionally faced east, away from the prevailing western winds that barreled across the plains with the subtlety of an angry bear. This wasn't superstition. It was meteorology practiced long before meteorologists went on television to gesticulate dramatically at animated weather maps. By facing east, the tipi reduced exposure to the most aggressive gusts, turning the doorway into a controlled entry instead of a wind tunnel. Next came the door flap, a hide covering that acted like a flexible but surprisingly effective shield. It could be lifted, tied back, weighted, doubled or layered depending on the season. Unlike a rigid wooden door, the flap moved with the wind instead of resisting it, preventing stress on the structure and reducing the risk of cold air barging inside uninvited. During harsh winter storms, a second flap or additional insulation could be added behind the main door, creating a miniature airlock. This two-layer system trapped cold air before it entered the main space, performing the same function as modern vestibules, but without the need for power strips, heaters, or awkward "please close both doors" signs. Inside the entrance, the teepee's interior lining also played a role. The lining didn't extend all the way to the doorway, but its presence helped redirect cold air downward, preventing it from sweeping into the living area. Any gust that managed to sneak past the flap was forced to behave, diverted into the airflow system, where it became part of the natural convection rather than an unwanted blast of Arctic personality. Another clever detail was how low the doorway was. Yes, this meant you had to bend a bit to go in and out, but given the choice between a dignified posture and not freezing to death, most people picked warmth over elegance. The low entrance prevented large volumes of warm air from escaping each time someone entered or exited. Altogether, the design turned what could have been a structural weakness into a functional strength. The entrance was not just a hole in the wall, it was an engineered barrier against the worst winter could offer. In a climate where one bad draft could ruin an entire night, the tipi door didn't just keep cold out, it kept comfort in. Stepping inside a well-built winter tipi during minus 30 degrees Celsius is a bit like stepping into a plot twist. You expect suffering, you expect your eyelashes to freeze, you expect the kind of cold that makes your bones file formal complaints. Instead, you find warmth. Real warmth, and a level of comfort that would make many European settlers stare in stunned silence, followed by the quiet internal acknowledgement that they had been living all wrong. A winter tipi didn't just block the cold, it created an interior microclimate. Between the buffalo hide exterior, the insulated inner lining, the central hearth, and the carefully managed airflow, the temperature inside could be so comfortable that people removed outer layers, worked freely, and slept without shaking like poorly wrapped burritos. This level of environmental control achieved with no metal stoves, no electric heaters, and no stack of firewood the size of a small village remains one of the most impressive achievements of indigenous engineering. Light came from the hearth and filtered through the hide covering, giving the space a warm amber glow, like choosing the cozy lighting option on a smart bulb, except the bulb is your entire home. Shadows danced softly along the walls, creating a flickering atmosphere perfect for storytelling, teaching, crafting tools, or simply passing time while the outside world attempted to freeze itself solid. Storage hung neatly from the poles, keeping tools, bags and belongings off the ground. This added organisation also helped maintain airflow around the walls, preserving the convection system that made the type so effective. Nothing felt cluttered, nothing felt cramped. It was a space shaped intentionally, not an accidental assortment of objects fighting for territory, which, let's be honest, describes many modern living rooms. Sleeping areas formed a ring along the outer edge, layered with hides and furs for insulation. Sleep now. Let yourself sink deeper into that perfect relaxation. Your eyelids are heavy. So heavy it would take too much effort to open them now. Your limbs feel pleasantly weighted, impossible to move even if you wanted to, which you don't. You just want to drift all the way down into deep, restful sleep. That's it. Just let go completely. The day is done. The work is finished. Nothing more required of you now except to rest, to renew, to dream perhaps of different possibilities, different worlds. But for now, just sleep deep and peaceful, easy and calm. Sleep now. Sleep well. Drifting deeper with each breath down and down into perfect, complete rest.